Hello. Welcome to this afternoon with Wendy Wolf, the Martin Luther King Jr. lecturer here at Elmhurst College. This lecture has been selected to be recorded for Chicago Amplified, a web-based audio program produced by WBEZ Chicago that captures some of the most exciting and informative cultural programming in the Chicago area. In your printed program, you'll find out how you can hear this lecture again or share it with others through Chicago Amplified. At this time, I'd like to ask that you please make sure your cell phones are turned off. And now I'm very pleased to introduce the president of Elmhurst College, Dr. S. Allen Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people here today. On behalf of the college, I would like to welcome you to this Martin Luther King lecture. I think it's going to be a very exciting one this afternoon. And in reflecting on this, a very brief thought for you. It seems to me that the significance of an historical figure to some degree can be measured by the extent to which in the subsequent decades their legacy becomes more, not less, complicated. And that is certainly the case with Dr. King. And I would suggest that that's also the case with Malcolm X. More, not less complicated. A fascinating and complicated subject indeed, one that drives and interweaves with the civil rights movement. So I think we're in for some very, very interesting discussion, conversation today. My purpose here simply is to welcome you and thank you for supporting the college by your attendance, for your participation, and your active questioning. I'm delighted to see everyone. Welcome and have a good afternoon. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the president of the Black Student Union, our student Evan Cunningham. Evan?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm the president of Black Student Union. It's a cultural student organization that has had its presence on the Elmhurst College campus since the 70s. We are rooted in our own history just as much as Malcolm X is rooted in our origin of being able to come to Elmhurst College and again partake in some of the opportunities that this institution has offered us. Black Student Union is an organization based not only in its support of its black students, helping to encourage African-American prospective high school students in coming to this college and supporting those here, but also in culturing a culture, of diversity on this campus as well. So in looking back in Black History Month, we look upon not only Malcolm X in his transformation and his message in forming the civil rights, in his participation, in civil rights movement, and also looking forward to how America's developed within his contributions as well. So I am excited that all of you are here to participate with us in reflecting upon the impact that Malcolm X has had and his life. And again, I encourage you to participate in the discussion, the question and answers, and enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Dr. Ronald Beauchamp, Director of the Niebuhr Center for Faith and Action. I've come here to introduce our guest speaker for the day, but I'd like to lead in with a little bit that says something that will help us think a little bit about why today has been set up in this way. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X are tied to each other through their contemporary status as leaders in the African American community. Martin and Malcolm developed such varying views on civil rights due to the social and economic lifestyles each man led. Martin's stable familial and financial security protected him from racism as opposed to Malcolm, whose family was broken and economically deprived. Martin became an integrationist while Malcolm became a nationalist. Martin's ideals were shaped by the emphasis of the black church and their compassion of themselves or comparison of themselves to the Hebrews of the Old Testament. Their belief that God would deliver them and lead them to a promised land gave King the inspiration to preach of an American dream to the black people. The Nation of Islam, on the other hand, with beliefs such as African race being the chosen people of God, was something that appealed to the inner city African American. Malcolm, who witnessed firsthand accounts of drug use, mistreatment of his family, being jailed for a period of time, created this desire in him to reach out and to touch other people using a different methodology. He, like so many, needed to believe that there was something better than the world in which he lived in. Dr. King and Malcolm X, for all their perceived personal and political differences, were leaders whose vision of America and its racial problems were growing increasingly closer to one another, but not yet overlapping at all. This is not to say that the two men might have come to some terms in some ways, but I would think that their philosophies and their policies challenged us. But it is to say that many of us today needed them to exist. Their varying positions complemented each other. Both philosophies were needed. If America was going to come to terms with how they were going to deal with the black experience, we needed both Martin and Malcolm. To have one would have only been a half-truth, and thus a distortion of the black reality in America. Although we are here to celebrate Dr. King and the guestship, it is imperative that we recognize Malcolm X's contribution to the civil rights movement, to the African American experience, and to our country. Dr. Manning Marable, a prolific writer, addressed issues of race and economic injustice in numerous works that establish him as one of the most forceful and outspoken scholars of African American history. He directed ethnic studies programs at a number of colleges, notably the Race Relations Institute at Fisk University and the Africana and Latin American Studies program at Colgate University. He was the chairman of the Black Studies Department at Ohio State University in the late 1980s and also taught ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. At Columbia University, he became a professor of public affairs, political science, history, and African American studies in 1993, was named the founding director for the Institute for Research in African American Studies and the Center for the Study of Contemporary Black History. He's written a book, nearly 600 pages in length, entitled Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. He drew on news sources, archival material, and government documents unavailable to Alex Haley, author of the autobiography of Malcolm X. Dr. Marable developed a fuller account of Malcolm X's politics, religious belief, and personal life, as well as his role in the civil rights movement and the circumstances that led to his assassination. He also offers a revisionist portrait of Malcolm X at its odds with Mr. Haley's presentation. And unfortunately, we are in a position to say that Dr. Marable could not be here with us today because prior to the book being published, he passed away. But instead of him, we are privileged to have with us today an outstanding publisher, the one who carried out the dream and is here today to continue to share in that legacy. Wendy Wolf helped him through all these years to put together meticulously this book. And we give her credit for this, and we thank her because this book has stirred controversy and praise all at the same time. Wendy Wolf is an associate publisher and editor of nonfiction at Viking, where she has also been an editor since 1994. Wolf is also a member of the PEN American Center and former chair of the AAP International Freedom to Publish Committee. It is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce to you Ms. Wendy Wolf.
Thank you, and good afternoon. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you this afternoon. I am Wendy Wolf, as billed, and it was my good fortune to be Manning Marable's editor, his publisher, his admirer, and his friend for most of the last 10 years, as my colleagues and I at Viking collaborated with him on the completion of his monumental project, indeed his life's work, which resulted in this book, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. I'm not a scholar, and it's been a long, long time since I sat in a classroom. I have been an editor my entire adult life, so I know a little bit about many, many things and not too much about any one thing. And generally, they tell me to talk for 45 seconds about my books, so this is an opportunity that I welcome. I am flattered and more than a little alarmed to find myself here, and I hope I can give you a small sense of what this book and its subject and its author meant to me, how it came to be, what kind of impact it's had, and most of all, why both Malcolm X and Manning Marable matter today. As most of you know, Manning Marable died last April, 3 days before the official publication of his book. He had suffered for many years from a debilitating lung disease and was tethered to an oxygen tank for the year before. He had had a successful double lung transplant. He survived the operation, which was itself a miracle, and was granted an extraordinary 9 extra months of life, which he devoted entirely to overseeing the final stages of his book. He lived to see it completed, and I'll never forget the phone call I got from him the day the first printed copy reached him, and the satisfaction bubbling through every corpuscle. He willed himself to see it through. He succumbed to pneumonia about a month later and died on April 1st. I have missed Manning every day since then, but never more than in moments like this, so that you too could see the twinkle in his eye and hear the twinkle in his voice. For someone who spent a lifetime studying a very angry, very outspoken, very driven man, Manning was stunningly upbeat, generous, and open-minded. If he were here addressing you today, you'd know at once that you were in the presence not just of a dedicated and accomplished scholar, but of an activist devoted to the cause of social justice, and one with full and experienced knowledge of the hard work, the energy, the pain, the disappointment, and the commitment that it would take to enact justice in our unjust world. At the same time, he was totally immersed in the enterprise of the university, of teaching and engaging new minds in the excitement of history. He began his career as a Caribbeanist, and he was one of the great pioneers in bringing African, Caribbean, and American history together in the academy. In fact, his interest in Malcolm came directly out of the classroom. He was teaching a course on the history of African American political thought at Ohio State. And naturally, the autobiography of Malcolm X was to be a key text. But the more he looked at that book, and the more he tried to match it up to the facts and the contours of what he knew about Malcolm's life, the more questions he had about the integrity of that remarkable book as a reliable record of a life. 2 decades later, I believe we now have as many answers to those questions as we'll ever have as a result of Manning's doggedness, his pig-headedness, his ability to charm and cajole and befriend his sources, his fundamental belief that this life, this man, held the key to understanding some very profound, if dark, truths about America. We all bring our own histories to the books we read, or in the case of being an editor, to the books we help into the world. I grew up in the segregated South in the 50s and 60s, so I came to Malcolm with more than an academic interest in the negotiation of race relations. I came to this project as someone who thought they knew Malcolm X because, of course, in high school I'd read the autobiography. And I thought I pretty much had the line on Malcolm. To be honest, when I read the autobiography as a teenager, I thought he was one scary dude. He represented a kind of anger, of violence, and extremism that as a kid in a nice liberal integrationist family, I found pretty threatening. In the New York Times book review of Malcolm X, the African-American commentator Touré said, and I'm quoting here, "Malcolm got under your skin. Whether he seeped into your pores and transformed the way you felt like a great love does, or he scared the living hell out of you." Well, I was in the latter category. It was like he was an alien arriving from the planet Xenon to live among us, and scared the pants off good progressives like me. I don't think I actually got all the way to the end of the book, and I had a lot to learn. And when Manning Marable first walked into my office in about 2004, I knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to tackle the enigma of Malcolm X. At that point, Manning was about 10 years into the documentation phase of what was then known as the Malcolm X Project at Columbia. When he decided it was time to get a publisher, he had written pages and pages of the life. More importantly, he and a retinue of devoted graduate students had assembled something known now in reverential terms as the chronology, a day-by-day, sometimes hour-by-hour account of Malcolm's every known move, deed, appearance, conversation, speech, or writing. It took up literally reams of yellow legal pads, scrawled in pencil and paper, taped together, stacked up. He was physically assembling a life. But what we all recognized was that the facts of Malcolm's life, as we assembled them, and the facts of anyone's life, would never be enough. The worst thing you can do in writing a biography is to stick to that life, to write what I call the he went here, he went there kind of story, or worse, to narrate Malcolm's life in real time. We needed to understand the worlds through which Malcolm moved, so we needed to understand about America, the America that blacks lived in and the ones that whites lived in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. We needed to understand what Malcolm's options were so that we could probe the choices he would make. We needed to get to know his family, his role models, his disciples, his enemies. We needed to know when he was lying about himself and why. And this was probably the biggest challenge we faced in the construction of the book, we had to make what I would simply call the case for Malcolm as a uniquely American figure. And I think the key to that is in a very deceptively simple idea. Malcolm not as foot soldier, not as fire breather, but as an agent of change. So what do I mean by that? There are two ways of looking at it. What Malcolm changed and how he changed himself. And both of them are crucial to getting at why he was unique and why he remains important. As I've talked about this book over the last year, a lot of people have been struck by the subtitle, A Life of Reinvention, and asked me to talk about this idea. It's been the subtitle since day one, since this image of reinvention was always at the heart of Manning's take on Malcolm. People now think that this means some kind of calculation or manipulation. And there's no question that Malcolm was a master at packaging and repackaging himself as his needs and his modes shifted. And he was a master performer as well. But what I think Manning meant was something with a lot more integrity and authority and authenticity. That Malcolm had the courage to learn, and to keep learning, and to keep incorporating what he learned into his own identity and into his calling. As Manning says in the introduction, and I quote, Malcolm's journey of reinvention was in many ways centered on his lifelong quest to discern the meaning and substance of faith. What do you believe is the righteous path? How will you walk it, and towards what end? We could easily have called it a life of education. The self-education of a man who walked out of his last classroom at 14, but who soaked up ideas and principles and visions for the next 25 years with a thirsty brain and a huge heart. Malcolm clearly had an extraordinary kind of native intelligence, and he was never stopped taking in new ideas. And just as importantly, he was not afraid to discard the old ones when they betrayed him or they turned out just simply to be wrong. I think of the most fundamental transformation of his engagement with the outside world, his first political tutor, Elijah Muhammad, who had imbued with him the principle that the only way Black America would survive and thrive was to withdraw, to separate, to become self-sufficient, and to sever all ties with and interests in white America. In a way, it's a kind of passivity, that withdrawal. So when he began his life as a political man who told his followers not to vote, at the end of his life, he spent every day getting on an airplane, going somewhere else to urge action, to urge engagement, all for the purpose of making change. He changed himself, and that's what I mean by an agent of change. Malcolm was a profoundly American figure in his ability to remake himself, and in his belief that we could remake society. We also could have called it simply a life of evolution, for he was always evolving, always testing philosophy against experience, what I call taking it out for a walk, taking his ideology out for a walk and trying to map it out against what he saw. So where did he look for this agency of change in America? To the Black community itself. And I think that is the biggest thing that stands between Malcolm and Martin Luther King, the question of whether Blacks could look to whites for any kind of solution. For the most part, and based on his own education in the streets of Boston, Detroit, Chicago, New York, he just didn't think you could look to white America for any answers. I'll come back to where I think he was headed at the end of his life, but for the most part, he drew on the strong belief in self-sufficiency imbued in him by his Garveyite parents, reinforced by the Black separatism that was at the heart of Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. So let's talk about the autobiography for a second, because like me, that was where most people started with Malcolm, and that's where most people end. It's where Manning started, and that's where his investigations are so revealing. It's a great story about the power of books themselves. You all probably know that Malcolm X worked on the book with the writer Alex Haley long before Alex wrote Roots and became interested in Africa. Alex had met Malcolm when he was interviewing him for Playboy. Haley had previously written about the Nation of Islam for Reader's Digest. These were different times, it was a different magazine. But he'd come to the attention of the Nation as someone who actually was telling it straight. Theirs was a great collaboration, and they had a wonderful time, and Manning tells wonderful stories about them kicked back in Haley's apartment, going over old times. But they were the oddest of couples. Alex Haley was a liberal Nixonian Republican. It's hard to believe such a thing existed, but he was one. He was, this was, as I say, decades before Roots. He was committed to the idea of integration. He was committed to the idea of a peaceful path. Malcolm had a very specific agenda when he started the autobiography. It gets back to this idea of faith. He wanted to write a redemption story. He wanted to show the power and force of the Nation of Islam and the kind of Islam that he learned from Elijah Muhammad. And the best way to do that was to show how it had saved him. To that end, he wanted to present himself as the wickedest of men. So he exaggerated his early life of crime so that he could make his jailhouse conversion seem all the more dramatic. Malcolm was, in fact, a petty criminal, a minor drug runner, a kind of low-level street thug. But he reconjured himself into something really low and really bad so that his salvation could be all the stronger. It was all going to work beautifully. The problem was, as the project lingered on, like most authors, they failed to meet their deadline. The story dragged on, the manuscript didn't get finished. Malcolm was coming to the end of his engagement with the Nation of Islam, and certainly with his popularity in it. In fact, Elijah Muhammad was building up a case to cast him out completely. Malcolm was losing faith in the nation, he was setting up his own rival institutions, and he was beginning to commit to another path. He embarked on a series of trips. He goes to Africa. He spent 9 of the last 12 months of his life in Africa. He goes on a Hajj. He encounters, for the last year, he's hardly in the country at all. And this is the period in which he's actually encountering Orthodox Islam. And he's finding out what it really has to offer and that it's not what Elijah Muhammad is selling. He's changing in very important ways. But he has no time to come back and talk to Alex Haley about this. No time to reconfigure the story to his new trajectory. And in 1965, he dies. Haley has choices at this point. And the one he makes is to take Malcolm's story not as a parable of faith that follows him through the journey into and beyond the Nation of Islam, into Africa, and, well, we don't quite know where. But to give the story the ending he, Alex Haley, wants, which is that Malcolm was on the verge of rejecting the nation to embrace integration. And in Haley's very benign and somewhat naive vision, to pose Malcolm as walking towards Martin Luther King. He deletes chapters that were actually drafted about Malcolm's evolving religious life because they are still simply too radical for Haley's mainstream and very relatively conservative civil rights mentality. Manning discovered some of these lost chapters in the archives at the Schoenberg Library, and we hope that someday, with the cooperation of all the many bodies who are involved, they can be restored to the autobiography, but they are certainly on view at the Schoenberg. So, Malcolm and Martin, the two great poles of black identity and of activism, the street fighter and the preacher, the devil and the saint. It's so easy to paint them like that, and it's so tempting to read into the great silence of their interrupted lives an optimistic reconciliation. The story of Malcolm and Martin are both the biggest what-ifs of the 20th century. But it's really hard for me to believe, knowing what I do know of both of them, knowing of their complicated lives, and the more we know about them, as Ken says, the more complicated they are. It's hard for me to believe that that scenario would have had Martin and Malcolm and Lyndon Johnson clasping hands and marching forth in lockstep towards the promised land. The evidence is just not there. You can project onto these men partially because their stories have no resolution, but also because Malcolm died at a moment of profound transition, an era of incredible churn in America. You could take that story any way you want, but the truth of it's the way people feel about Kennedy. If only Kennedy had lived, we wouldn't have gone to Vietnam. We don't know that. Certainly what Oliver Stone believes, which is why he's obsessed with Kennedy. But it's just, we don't know. It's the what if of American society. But frankly, it's Manning's belief, and it's become my belief, that I didn't see a future with too many prayer circles with whites in the 2 years down the line. And I talked to Manning at some length about this because we always knew it would have been one of the focal points of the conversation about the book, and one of the things Manning was so looking forward to engaging in when the book was published. As Manning saw it, Malcolm was simply more realistic about race than King was. He knew from real first-hand experience where the huge and the persistent barriers in America were erected. Malcolm saw the reality of people's lives and their living conditions. He saw the redlining. He understood how loaded were the economic dice, the things that had little to do with the grander themes of the civil rights movement. More importantly, as I've said, he never believed that white America was going to save black America, and that it was largely a waste of time to put your faith in that idea. And a lot of what he understood about economics, about human nature, lies today in the persistence of the racial divide and of the shackling of the underclass. Only yesterday, as some of you may have seen this, a news story broke of a speech that Malcolm gave at Brown University. A tape has finally come forth about this. In 1961, Malcolm read a story written in the Brown College newspaper by a young woman criticizing the Nation of Islam, saying that she felt that it was not the right path and integration was the path. And Malcolm gets on a plane and flies to Providence, Rhode Island to talk to the Brown student body. The person who invites him there turns out to be Richard Holbrook, who was an undergraduate at the time. All of this is irrelevant to the story. This part of the story is a little quote that they found in the speech, which is, "We don't have time for the white man. You are wasting your time talking to the white man. We are working on our own people." But so that was Malcolm's line for most of his life. But people don't give Malcolm quite enough credit for the subtleties of his last months. He saw the great achievements of black communities and neighborhoods. Which convinced him of the real gains that could be made in community building. But he was also beginning to give space to the idea that whites could be people too. And I will come back to this idea because it's an important piece of the puzzle. But first I want to touch on that other what if, which is the role of Malcolm in global Islam. Malcolm left the Nation of Islam and spent almost all of the last years of his life in Africa, where he experienced and was profoundly affected by the practice of Orthodox Islam, and it was an eye-opener to him. African nationalism was on the rise, but not based on the kind of eccentric ideology of Elijah Muhammad and the nation. It was instead actively pushing Malcolm in the opposite direction, which is towards a vision of a human rights that's globally based, that transcends race, that transcends national boundary, and that was an open and engaging way of experiencing the world. On these trips, Malcolm met practically every African head of state, and he was treated as a head of state. He becomes engaged in this idea of Pan-Africanism, of the bridges that could be built that could help black Americans. He wanted Africa to help change the U.S., but the Africans also wanted to use him as a chip to change the U.S. behavior towards Africa. I think they overestimated his pull, but it does leave you with some tantalizing fantasies about what a mature Malcolm, embracing the humanism that is in Islam, might have done with that idea and with that power. So I've talked a little bit about the autobiography, so let's talk a little bit about the other great strike for Malcolm, which in popular culture, which is Spike Lee's film. It's an amazing movie. It's amazing that it got made. It's amazing that he got the money. It's amazing that when he ran out of money, he kept getting more money. It's amazing that he made it during the 80s, during the worst of the Reagan years, when black and white and rich and poor were at each other's throats. It's amazing that he got to film in Mecca. It's amazing that he got so much right. And rather worry about what he got wrong, which I can talk about as well, I think the contribution he really made was to put Malcolm back on the table, to bring him back into the conversation. Yes, he prettied him up. It's the story that Betty wanted to tell. It's the story of their marriage, and it's filmed with warm and loving imagery of a marriage that it's fair to say in reality had more than its share of heartache and betrayal. And no, Betty didn't look much like Angela Bassett. But he got at something vital about Malcolm's heart. He only made one big mistake. And I think I'm unique in feeling that this is his mistake. You get to the end of the movie, and the credits start to roll, and almost everybody gets up and leaves the theater. I have always sat through the credits my entire life. I don't know why, but I do. And what he does at the end of the movie is he rolls actual footage of Malcolm. Malcolm speaking, Malcolm talking, Malcolm walking, and he is mesmerizing. He is electrifying. You can't take your eyes off of him. He obliterates all images of Denzel Washington left, and you think, this is the real Malcolm. I get it. You suddenly get it. It falls into place. When we were looking at photographs for the jacket of the book, we just poured over images. I just wanted to look at more pictures. No, let's look at more pictures, more pictures. We pulled up footage. We watched newsreels. Go on YouTube. Google Malcolm X. It's unbelievable to watch him. He was electrifying. The camera loved him, and he loved it. So watch the movie, but remember, it's a movie. Be grateful for what Spike did, and stay through the credits. One of our great challenges in putting this book together was figuring out, beyond Malcolm, what else you needed to know. Who here remembers who Marcus Garvey is? What the LA riots were? Who is Frantz Fanon? What were Zoot Suits? It's a world that's disappeared, and it's a world that's so important to the construction of Malcolm's identity. But what I was especially keen to do, and Manning was completely on board with this, was to remind people of the physical courage it took to do what these people did. As someone who publishes history, it's always alarming to me how ephemeral that history really is, how memory slips away, and how all too often the drama of history is reduced to dates and facts. The human anguish, the bravery is boiled out of it. I published 2 years ago a book on Freedom Summer, and I made all the kids in our office read it. So all these kids in their 20s are reading about Mississippi summer when all these nice white Jewish liberals from New York went down to Mississippi to do voter registration. And one by one, they all start coming to my office saying, it was really dangerous. I mean, I knew about, Schreiner and, the three men were killed, but they were really in danger. People threw bottles at them. People kidnapped them, people tortured them, people hated them. They were just trying to register voters. And I said, yes, it was dangerous. It took an act of physical courage to do what these people do. So we set out to rebuild an era in both its light and its dark. And I think that's why this book is going to stay around for so long, because it really does recapture an era and places in the middle of it somebody who is more than a hero and is more than a cardboard icon. I tell people to read this book, and I say, it's not like homework. It's not like eat your vegetables. It's a real book. It's fun. You can do it. Now, obviously, when you take an icon and you make him human, some folks are going to be let down, and we've had our share of pushback. It's always a surprise to me when we publish a controversial book where the fires are going to be lit, under what particular fact. And I should have suspected all along that it was going to be page 66. But I didn't really see it coming. So I'll tell you about it now so you don't have to stand up and ask an embarrassing question. 1944, Malcolm is working in Boston. He's at loose ends. He doesn't have much money. He doesn't have any skills. And he goes to work for a rich white man named Paul Lennon. He's a kind of a surfer. He's a servant. He's a kind of a gopher. And Lennon asks him to perform certain sexual favors for him, which he does. He's a young man. He's getting by as well as he can. And he tells this story. He tells this story in the autobiography, but he gives it to someone else. He makes it happen to someone else. But he tells his sister and he tells his brother that this happened to him. And it's a truth about Malcolm. Manning is meticulous in saying there is no evidence anywhere of any other statements about activities in or other subsequent behavior that has anything to do with homosexuality, but this happened in Malcolm's life, so live with it. We also tackle the reality of Malcolm's marriage and his family life. The Nation of Islam was a very hard place for women. It was punitive and unforgiving and uncompromising. Malcolm was away from his family for days and weeks on end. They scrambled for money. They owned nothing of their own. Their house was firebombed, and there's no question that theirs was a rocky relationship, that his and Betty's was a rocky relationship. Betty may have been married to a martyr, but she was still left the widowed mother of 6 daughters, including 2 twins born after Malcolm's death. While they may have been celebrities, they lived under a long shadow, and life never got easier for them. But it serves no one well to dress up the story in false finery, and the dose of reality that Manning gives us about Malcolm's marriage and his infidelities serves to complete the picture of him as a man. You can't do it if you stick to the fairy tale. It just doesn't fly. Obviously, the story of Malcolm's murder is the climax of our book, and the focus of so much of Manning's long and dogged research, tracking down overlooked witnesses, dusting off old New York Police Department records, finally getting the FBI tapes. I have to say, being the target of an FBI investigation wrecks the hell out of your civil liberties, but it's a gift to historians. And Manning made quite clear that regardless of who had been arrested, tried, and put in prison for Malcolm's assassination, the actual trigger man was walking free as a bird across the river in New Jersey. Today. Now. One of the things he'd really hoped for the book was to reopen the investigation. There was a flurry of activity when we published, but the institutional forces and the institutions against it have proved to be too great. I'm often asked, well, was there a conspiracy? I'd say there was a very convenient convergence of interests, a convergence of interests from the FBI, from the New York Police Department, from the Nation of Islam, from the Newark Mosque, from a lot of different people who would be just as happy if Malcolm didn't exist. The afterlife of an icon is probably the biggest challenge to any biographer. When Malcolm died, so many claimed him. The Panthers, the New Black Nationalists, Alex Haley, 1999, the U.S. Post Office, put him on a stamp. And more darkly in recent days, a number of Islamic extremists have grabbed Malcolm, held him up as their new poster boy, tried to reinvent the image. Because of the big blank slate of the second half of his life, all sorts of people could throw their hopes and their fears onto him. He's inspired filmmakers, writers, painters, rappers. His is one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. But they all wanted to freeze him in time, which is where I think they get it wrong, and which is why Malcolm matters. It wasn't his anger, and it wasn't his fiery rhetoric. It was his skepticism, his discontent, his pragmatic, intelligent assessment of the way the cards were stacked in America. That's why, to me, he looks more and more prophetic of the 21st century's disappointments. And that's how he understood how the forces keeping black and white effectively separate and unequal simply became hidden in institutional structures when they were no longer actually laws. Malcolm would have understood the 21st century. Malcolm, of course, can still make the news. Only yesterday, as I've described, where this speech has come to light. But what's interesting to me, well, the speech, I've told you the story about how he's invited in 1961, a young woman invites him in. She has just found, the story's been dug up, a reporter has come to see her, and she finds the actual tape in her attic. Other moral of the story, never clean out your attics. Historians will thank you for that. But what I think is really important in the story is not what the speech said, it's the comments that she made to the reporters who've talked to her afterward. And she says, he was incredibly nice to me. After the speech was over, he came back, he hung out with us, he wanted us to understand, he was reaching out to us. He wanted us to respond, he wanted to be engaged, he wanted to educate us. He didn't want to convert us, he was respectful. And that's what I think the real punchline of this book is. It's restoring Malcolm's humanity. Human beings are always more interesting than either saints or devils. And Manning was able to find the authentic, believable, wholly organic Malcolm, who was a kind man and who was arriving in a different place in his life when he was killed. And it's a convincing portrait. When Manning died, I started to hear from all sorts of people all over the country and all over the world who had either known Malcolm or had known Manning. And one of them was a wonderful reporter named Fred Powledge, who had covered the civil rights movement for the New York Times in the 1960s. And Fred wrote to me and he said, "He and you have done such a wonderful job of explaining something and someone who's always been a mystery to me. I had lunch with Malcolm one day at the Shabazz restaurant uptown, and I always wondered how to square the intelligent, gentle person with whom I ate beans and rice with what many people were saying about him, and what eventually made him such a danger that he had to be murdered." So that's the final conundrum, over and over, trying to reconcile the affable guy that Fred met with the demagogic statements he made in public. There's a famous other story told by Gordon Parks, which is in our book. There's an encounter that Malcolm has, and I think it's in Spike's movie, with a young white college student after she's heard him speak, and she comes up to him and she says, "Tell me what I can do. Tell me what I can do to help the black Muslims." And he looks at her and he says, "Nothing," and he walks away. 2 weeks before he dies, he meets with Gordon Parks, the great black photographer and political activist, and Gordon says to him, "Is there anything about your life you regret?" He said, "I regret what I told that young woman." And there's a little glimmer of where Malcolm is going. He wished he'd been better to a young white woman who had asked how she could be of help to black Muslims. Could it be that at the end of his life, Malcolm had come to reconcile these two things in himself, that he was finally able to square his own appreciation of white individuals with the power of those individuals that might have the actual leverage to change the system? Not the ideas that whites and blacks should go skipping hand in hand singing Kumbaya, but that only whites and blacks exerting a combined power on the system would actually change it. It dazzles my mind to think of where the understanding of that power might have taken us. The Malcolm faithful have risen up to attack this book, and if you don't believe me, just go on Amazon. They think it is a tragedy to distort the image of a heroic and a revolutionary with tawdry personal details. But I don't think that's what Manning is doing. I think he has not made him one iota less revolutionary by making him more dynamic, by, and I quote, "evolving at every point in his brief but exceptional public life that he was struggling to synthesize reality with his original far more facile beliefs." I return to the idea of faith at its broadest definition. Malcolm's life as a quest to discern the meaning and substance of faith, not as a fixed ideology or doctrine or an unswerving moral certitude, but the kind of faith that allows you to change your mind, to evolve, to reinvent. So, at the end of the day, what is Malcolm's legacy and what is Manning Marable's? Well, if Manning were here, he'd be chasing you out of this room and out into the streets. There are story after story of his escapades of getting people to do things out in the world that they had had no intention whatsoever of doing. He was that persuasive. Saul Alinsky had nothing on him as a community organizer, and Manning was a very dangerous man if you were a defender of the status quo. But in terms of what Manning thought Malcolm's legacy was, you'll forgive me if I just let Manning speak for himself, and I read you a few passages. This is at the very end of the book when he's talking about al-Qaeda embracing Malcolm as an icon. What is truly ironic is that Malcolm would certainly have condemned the terrorist attacks on September 11th as representing the negation of Islam's core tenets. A religion based on universal compassion and respect for the teachings of the Torah and the Gospels, Malcolm would have known, holds no common ground with those who employ terror as a tool for politics. Malcolm's personal journey of self-discovery, the quest for God, led him toward peace and away from violence. A deep respect for and belief in black humanity was the heart of this revolutionary visionary's faith. And as his social vision expanded to include people of divergent nationalities and racial identities, his gentle humanism and anti-racism could have become a platform for a new kind of radical, global, ethnic politics. Instead of the fiery symbol of ethnic violence and religious hatred, as al-Qaeda might project him, Malcolm X should become a representative for hope and human dignity. at least for the African American people, he's already come to embody these loftier aspirations. Malcolm X and Manning Marable were very different men. One was a street fighter propelled for most of his life by anger, the other a scholar brimming with hope. But they were united in their ceaseless efforts on behalf of racial equality, human rights, and social justice. Manning bridged new frontiers in the documentation of African, Caribbean, and American lives, and he inspired a generation of young historians to take the ideas they were studying out of the classroom and out into the world, not just to do history, but to make history. Malcolm and Manning shared a vision of a just and a peaceful world, and both had voices that were silenced far too soon, when they both had so much more to tell us and to teach us. Neither lived to see the world fully embrace the vision of social justice and equality in their lifetimes. I hope that it is the legacy of this book and of Manning Marable's life that we might find it in ours. Thank you.
And we do have time for questions, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you.
I said it all? It's a question in the back.
Greetings. Thank you, Wendy. It was a very informative presentation you gave us today. I'm interested in a relationship that Malcolm may have had with Fidel Castro. There were certainly, I heard Fidel was inspired by his devotion to cause, and I was wondering if you ever found any parallels between Fidel's success in Cuba and Malcolm's philosophy and message.
Well, the biggest difference is Fidel actually got to run something. Malcolm never got to run anything. You know? I don't know. I don't know how much I have to say on that. Malcolm spent most of his life trying to separate from the institutions of government. You know, he didn't believe he embraced the nation's attitude that government wasn't going to help. But he also wasn't fomenting revolution in the way that you traditionally think of Castro saying, trying to get other people to join him in a cause. Malcolm had, I think, a much more subtle idea of where revolution would take place. And he did not actually, one of the misconceptions about Malcolm is that he espoused violence. One of Malcolm's most famous speeches, and he gave it 4 times, is called The Ballot or the Bullet. And what he said was, unless you let Black America engage, and this is when he's beginning to think voting is probably a good idea, unless you let Black America engage, I'm not going to be able to hold them back. There are going to be fires in the street. I'm not saying I think you should burn that house down. That house is just going to burn because of the wrongness of the way our society is organized. And I don't think that's to me, that's not the image that we have of Castro. Maybe 50 years from now, we'll find out the complications of Castro as much as we find out the complications. Because we're stuck with an icon. We're stuck with a certain image of Castro that he's produced. And my experience is certainly the images are very deceiving.
Part of it you said earlier that some people have criticized the book because of giving him the human elements more. But what I think is that sometimes people are a lot more inspired by someone they can relate to that's more human, that feels feelings and isn't just something on a screen,
So you think we've done a good thing?
Yes.
Yes, I agree.
To some people, yeah.
I agree.
Not everyone agrees with everything, but
yeah. No,
yeah.
I think you sometimes look at these great figures and you go, oh, well, they're perfect. I could never be that person, I could never be that smart or that committed or that whatever. And then you find out, yeah, you could. You too could do this. And I think that is one of the great gifts that Manning has produced, is that he's returned Malcolm to us as a hero.
Hi, can you speak a little bit more to the split with the Nation of Islam?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that were going on. Malcolm is Elijah Muhammad's greatest disciple. He is a brilliant speaker. He's a brilliant money raiser. He walks into a room and people just open their wallets and start shaking them out, you know. You just couldn't resist him. So there's a problem when you start to become more powerful than your leader, more powerful than the one man at the pinnacle of your very steeply hierarchical organization. So Elijah Muhammad is beginning to get jealous of Malcolm. He's beginning to worry. Malcolm is finding out, on the other hand, that Elijah Muhammad is not the pure man that he espouses, and he does not, in fact, conduct himself with the purity that he is preaching to the rest of the world. He's something of a sexual predator. He actually has impregnated several of the secretaries of the nation, and including a young woman whom Malcolm has been in love with for many years. It was sadly not the woman he was allowed to marry, and I think that betrayal, he can't quite say, my father has betrayed me, but that understanding of who Elijah Muhammad really is, eats at Malcolm, and he is cast out, and Malcolm begins to set up a separate organization that has some overlap, but is beginning to incorporate what he's learning in Africa, what he's learning from other revolutionaries, what he's learning from King, what he's learning. He's just learning all the time. And I think that's the part that got left out in the two-dimensional version of Malcolm.
We have a question over here.
Sir.
Hi. Malcolm X, he hung out with jazz musicians and Cassius Clay, and he was like the anti-celebrity, but yet he
was a real celebrity.
He pulled that off. He made great copy. I thought that was how he was able to do that was very interesting.
Yeah, he's the man who converted Cassius Clay, you know, and then Clay discards him when he leaves the nation. But he loved being a celebrity. He loved being out there, and the camera loved him. And the New York Times covered every one of his speeches. He was in the paper all the time. He was on television all the time. I mean, it was a very, very familiar sight. Even before YouTube, you know. So he made great copy. There's no question about it. But he liked traveling in high circles like that.
Good afternoon. I was at a seminar during the summer at the Woodson Library in Chicago, wherein some of the black professors of some of the black studies in some of the universities and colleges made this comment that in the title, A Life of Reinvention, rather than using evolution, metamorphosis, or redemption. They really objected to that. And I think you sort of touched on that, because sometimes you can think people reinvent themselves for their own benefit or whatever. But the thing that I have the most problem with is the research about, I don't care whether Malcolm X, had this affair with this man or not. I like James Baldwin and other people, and that's not important to me. But I don't think the research that is presented in the bibliography in the book or in the book really substantiates that. And that is a problem. And because it's like, well, his stepsister said this, and her son said this. Recently, somebody told me that somebody told them I was married to a Caucasian man, which is not true. So people are always hearsaying and saying, and I don't think that the research really rose above that, because when I checked the bibliography, it says check to something else in the autobiography. So I think that's a weakness in the book, and you might want to take a look at that. But other than that, I agree with those who have said that the book gives us so much more insight so many years later into Malcolm X, and especially through the use of the diaries. And there is a response to this book. It's called By Any Means Necessary. It's published by Third World Press in Chicago.
Thank you.
Hello. Did Malcolm X ever embrace Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, or anything? Did he have anything to say about that, and primarily his ascendancy into some sort of a cultural icon took place during the hippie movement? And I was wondering if he had any.
I don't actually have an answer to that question.
No, huh?
I think I mean, there's not, to my recollection, there's no flirtation with that.
With anything such as an Eastern religious philosophy?
No, I think he became quite...
or the American hippie movement?
He became quite a disciple of Orthodox Islam. I mean, he literally spent the last year of his life, in Black Africa.
Right, so that any Eastern philosophy wouldn't have played a part in his...
I don't think
overall philosophy.
Yeah, not that I think we need Manning for that. I'm
okay.
afraid.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
He dies right in the midst of all the civil rights turmoil and the Selma March and so forth. Would you say more about the conspiracy theories and why it was so, quote, convenient for these various factors, FBI and police, et cetera, to be considered as possible
They thought he was a troublemaker. They thought he was trouble. I mean, this is Hoover's FBI. This is, these are institutions that are committed to keeping the peace, and they think that he is someone who's going to espouse violence. One of the great kind of footnotes in this story is that one of the New York Police Department detectives who was assigned to listen to Malcolm, and he spends hours, they've bugged him, they've bugged everywhere, they've got all of his speeches, and he spends hours listening to him, and he wakes up and he says, wait a minute, this guy isn't spouting violent revolution. He actually makes a lot of sense. And he becomes completely converted to Malcolm's way of thinking. He turns out to be one of the great sources for our books, But he, so that I think that's an indication of what people were projecting onto Malcolm. And they just thought this was America was in many ways a tinder waiting to get lit. And they didn't want him to strike the match. It was convenient for the FBI, which were very violently opposed to any kind of radicalism, and it was very convenient for the Nation of Islam to have him removed. So, as I said, it was a convergence of convenient interests there.
This will be the last question.
One of the prior biographies on Malcolm X, one written by Bruce Perry, had, and I know that there's been some questions raised about some of the points that he made, but it seemed that the thrust of that book was that Malcolm, knowing the power of his image, actually helped push the civil rights movement forward because, I mean, in a way, he almost kind of presented it as, okay, you can deal with Martin,
deal with him or you can deal with me.
What are your thoughts? What did Manning touch on that at all? What were the thoughts you guys
I don't
as you're
think he
working
really
on that
cared
book?
that much about the civil rights movement, to be honest. I mean, he met Martin Luther King once. They run into each other of all places in Congress, the halls of Congress where they're both visiting. I don't think he wasted much time for most of his life thinking about that kind of strategy. I think he was so passionately committed to his own vision that he wasn't saying, all right, if I play the bad guy, then they'll go to the good guys and we'll get ahead that way. I don't personally buy into that theory. But again, it's one of the great what ifs of Malcolm's life.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So now you get the...
Oh, now I get my present.
Now you get your present. So much, and then I'm going to say a couple words. If I could have your attention for just a minute, just a couple of housekeeping notes. By the way, my name is Russell Ford. I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at the college and the director of intercultural studies. So thank you all, by the way, for coming out today. It's great to see such a crowd for such an important and I think fascinating lecture. Ms. Wolf has agreed to sign books following her presentation, and they are available for purchase just on the other side of the fireplace. If you'd like to have your book signed, please queue up here in the center aisle in just one column right there, please. I also wanted to encourage all of you all to attend a couple of upcoming events that we have here at the college, especially the Bernardin Lecture tomorrow evening entitled Evangelizing the Culture, and it will feature Father Robert Barron. It'll be at 7:30 right here in Founders Lounge. And then on Thursday at 7 o'clock in the chapel, right on the other side of the quad, Robert Putnam will be here, and he'll present a lecture entitled Religion, Democracy, and Civic Engagement. And if you weren't taking notes as I remarked on that, you can find more information on our website at www.elmhurst.edu. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Our lectures are free, but they are not without cost. So if you've enjoyed tonight's lecture, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the Friends of the Arts here at Elmhurst College. And you can use, there's envelopes that you received with your program, or just hand your contribution to one of the students who are forming a bit of a bucket brigade there in the back. We greatly appreciate your support. And again, thank you for coming out this afternoon. Please join me again in thanking Wendy.